life. He wants the people to be able to live in a civilized country, a civilized and socialist country. It is his will and his intention that the people may one day enjoy a very modern lifestyle. This shows that we're trying to develop not just the leisure industry, but also sport, healthcare and culture. We're trying to live in a more civilized world, basically.
The despot Kim Jong-un has decreed the North Koreans should have fun. The country has supposedly entered a new era with fun for everyone. At least, that's the image that the authorities want to display to foreign visitors. On the outskirts of Pyongyang, this equestrian center is Marshal Kim Jong-un's latest creation.
This equestrian center is for the benefit of everybody, workers, employees, old people, and even small children.
Nothing is left to chance. There's no room for improvisation.
I'm on my way. They want to see the merry-go-round. Get everything ready, quickly, and let the others know. We're on our way.
The horse symbolizes North Korea's power. If you believe what the North Koreans say, the Kim family comes from a long line of horsemen. The legend surrounding the supreme leader continues.
Between 1990 and today, Marshal Kim Jong-un got on a horse 300 times, advised and coached by General Kim Jong-il. He worked very hard at it. In order to become a great horseman, he studied and read many books which enabled him to master every aspect of horse riding. That's why he's such an expert now.
The myth surrounding Kim Jong-un borders on the grotesque. Indoctrination seeps into every aspect of life. Our presence here serves to export this ultra-propaganda across the country's borders.
The role journalists play is very important. That's why we're taking the documentary you are making of our country so seriously. We hope that you will take what we have told you and turn it into a fair and objective documentary.
Part of the schedule for the day is a visit to Marshal Kim's latest folly, a ski resort 200 kilometers from Pyongyang. His time studying in Switzerland gave him a taste for winter sports. The regime has spent $300 million on the construction of this complex. But Kim Jong-un has also achieved his objective of circumventing the embargo on leisure goods imposed by the international community.
We have 10 ski slopes here at the Masik Resort, 9 for professional skiers and 1 for beginners. We started building these slopes in May 2013, and we finished on the last day of December 2013. That's what the Marshal required, and we achieved it. Our leader even promoted our resort all over the world. Skiing is part of our country's culture. And so Kim Jong-un wanted this resort built to develop our civilization.
But who in North Korea can afford the luxury of a holiday here? No one is willing to explain the circumstances of their stay here.
The resort was designed with the people in mind, and the prices too have been set with the people in mind.
In Marshal Kim Jong-un's socialist country, money remains a taboo subject. Only 5,000 North Koreans are estimated to have the means to use this resort. In the opinion of this North Korean refugee, these new facilities are unacceptable.
중요한 건 아니고요.
It's all so ridiculous. People are starving to death, and these facilities are only for rich people from Pyongyang and no good to anyone else. The reality is that people in North Korea are suffering. When I see all these leisure facilities being built, I think to myself that it's just to placate the people and show people abroad that the country is capable of achieving these things. All the money spent on building these things could have been redistributed throughout the population. This is just throwing money out of the window.
North Korea's economic difficulties do not stop the regime from spending money hand over fist. Every 2 years, Pyongyang puts on a film festival open to foreigners. This is a way for the authorities to present an image of cultural and material prosperity to the world.
We declare the 13th Pyongyang International Film Festival open.
The films and cartoons shown all follow the party line, of course. This amenability towards the world outside North Korea is limited, and tributes to the leader are never far away.
This event is all the more important because it only takes place thanks to the interest and the love that Marshal Kim Jong-un has for the cinema. You're about to watch films which are completely innovative in both form and content.
North Korean cinema has a central role in the propaganda machine. It educates even before it entertains. The film festival also allows the regime to present itself in a good light, a message relentlessly driven home by the Ministry of Culture.
We want independence, friendship, and peace between peoples.
All over the world?
Yes, all over the world.
A select group of dignitaries and a few foreigners are being treated to a soirée orchestrated by the great and good of the regime. But behind this facade of a smiling, prosperous North Korea, the regime maintains control over every citizen's life. In this country of supreme leaders, even the smallest event is an opportunity to pay tribute to the leadership. Under North Korea's totalitarian system, there is no other choice. To commemorate the 60th anniversary of the end of the Korean War, the population of Pyongyang is requisitioned to pay tribute to its army.
General Kim Jong-il said, To safeguard our country, one can live without candy, but one cannot live without bullets.
Our guide's words are directly influenced by the Songun doctrine, devised by the former leader Kim Jong-il, which gives the army the dominant role in building North Korea's socialism. Like his father, Kim Jong-un perpetuates the tradition of large public parades. In this way, he sets the scene for his own power and that of North Korea. The army is the keystone of the regime, with 1 million North Koreans enlisted and 1/3 of the population reservists.
북한의 열병식은 독특한 대열 방식입니다.
These parades are quite remarkable. I think they used to do something similar in the former USSR. What leaders Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il taught us was a style of military marching called the Hell March, which dated from the end of the war with Japan. It's a style that Kim Il-sung was already using when he fought the Japanese. The idea is to intimidate the enemy. When you do a hopping goose step like that, it's rough on the stomach. When we trained, we were told to wear 2 leather belts done up very tightly under our belly. This pushed up your stomach, which you can imagine is very painful. I took part in training for these parades while I was a student at military college. But a few days before the parade, I contracted paralysis in my legs because of the hopping. So I was unable to take part and had to go back to college. The training is extremely hard. It felt like being a prisoner in a labor camp. And in North Korea, not to be able to take part in the parades is very shameful.
In order to establish his authority over the army and the party, Kim Jong-un took his inspiration from the darkest days of Stalinism. In December 2013, the young dictator began a violent purge of the state's apparatus. Any officials who could have got in his way were brutally eliminated, beginning with his own uncle, Jang Song-taek, who was very influential at the heart of the regime.
The Special Military Tribunal of the Ministry of State Security of the Republic of Korea has found the accused, Jang Song-taek, guilty of acts of subversion against the state. His goal was to overthrow the power of the proletariat by aligning himself with our ideological enemies. This crime carries the severest penalty under Article 60 of our Penal Code. This upstart, this traitor to the revolution, is condemned to death. The decision is to be implemented with immediate effect.
Jang Song-taek was shot, according to the party line, for fomenting a coup d'etat. He was said to be overly immersed in commercial activities with China. Any hope of the regime relaxing its approach was definitively snuffed out. Kim Jong-un has asserted himself as a warlord. His frequently bellicose directives are followed to the letter by North Korea's soldiers.
After the Kim Jong-un regime took power, training became more and more intense. He was determined to crush South Korea by force. He was very insistent on the weapons we had to use and ordered us to use all our ammunition on every training drill. I remember the directives changing when he took over. We had to go up into the mountains more and more often for training sessions, 2 or 3 times a week. And everything changed from a military equipment point of view. We got new and better munitions, like armor-piercing bullets. I think Kim Jong-un wants to prove to Koreans that he is capable of preparing the country for a war against South Korea.
Marshal Kim Jong-un regularly challenges his southern neighbor and enemy. The regime's belligerent rhetoric goes hand in hand with provocative acts such as nuclear trials or military maneuvers. The state needs an enemy to justify the economic priority given to the military. This policy operates with no regard for the population, which outside Pyongyang is still vulnerable. Between 1994 and 1998, the country suffered its worst ever famine, which caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people.
At that time, I was a soldier, and I had some serious health issues. I'd lost a lot of weight. I remember that opposite my barracks, there was a woman who used to deliver food to the Labour Party cells. I went to see the farm manager and pleaded with him to give me some apples. I said, "Give me an apple before I starve to death." So he said, "You can eat what you like when you're here, but you can't take anything with you. Otherwise, all the other soldiers will end up coming here and your superiors will confiscate your food." I lived on an apple in the morning and an apple in the evening for several months.
Nowadays, there are no great famines, but lack of food is still the main thorn in the regime's side. A third of the country's population suffers from malnutrition and is dependent on a public food distribution system.
The state buys cereals and other foodstuffs from the farmers at a low price and then redistributes them among the population. Depending on the number of people in the family, they get more or less food. More is given to families where there are adults.
The regime is still incapable of feeding its people, but is keen to convince us that the opposite is true. Our journey now takes us on a visit to a naturally exemplary farm.
Travel around America and you're bound to run into the Constitution. It seems to be everywhere.
the Constitution.
Our Constitution.
The Constitution?
You haven't read the Constitution.
This little document, it means everything to us.
It's like the Big Bang. It's the most momentous thing to happen in the modern world.
The Constitution has been around for more than 225 years, but many of us don't have any idea what it says. Of course, that's never stopped us from arguing about what it means. I'm Peter Sagal, and I'm taking a journey across the country to find out how the Constitution works in the 21st century. In this episode, the framers thought they'd come up with a pretty good system, but even they didn't really think the Constitution would be around forever.
They would be astonished that it has lasted in the form in which they crafted it.
In fact, it's lasted longer than any other written constitution still in use today.
It's this brilliant thing that we did.
Along the way, it's been pushed to the brink.
I'm not a crook.
And stretched to the breaking point.
In every war, there are a lot of people who think the president acts too aggressively.
So there are like federal agents in your bedroom. You're a 16-year-old girl.
Police officers, everything.
Over the years, we've given that document a real workout. And these days, it seems like it's taking a lot of hits.
We are on the brink of a partial government shutdown.
Shut it down! This dysfunction is brought about by the election of crazy people.
And what's lost are a lot of the voters in the middle.
We the people have to have an intervention. Uncle Sam is a drunk.
Your constitutional provisions are no match for me.
Is our Constitution up to the challenges of the 21st century?
Civics is a dirty business, ladies and gentlemen.
Sometimes the search for the American Constitution takes you places even a Harley can't go. Welcome to Reykjavik, Iceland. This country of about 300,000 people became an international financial capital during the boom years. Then in the crisis of 2008, everything fell apart. The three largest banks collapsed. Parliament, which meets in that building over there, fell. The prime minister resigned. Now, to keep anything like this from ever happening again, the people of Iceland right now are engaged in creating and then approving a brand new national constitution. They're throwing the old one out and starting again. The Icelanders took a real 21st century approach, inviting ordinary citizens to submit ideas via Facebook and Twitter. That's why Article 6 is nothing but cat videos. All right, I'm kidding. Maybe they're on to something, creating a new constitution, one that's custom built for modern times. Some of the members of the Constitutional Council are traveling the country to promote their new crowd-sourced national charter, and I asked them for a lift.
This is pleasant. This is the magic bus, you call it?
Yes.
Are you guys sleeping on the bus?
No.
Just napping.
Wow, so this is it. This is the draft Constitution?
It's yours.
Yes. Oh, thank you. Are there other members of the Constitutional Committee on the bus?
Yes.
Oh, well, we have to get you to sign it then.
Founding father.
Exactly.
And some others.
Thank you very much. I will not sell this on eBay.
One of today's stops is a remote fishing village where they will try to get the locals to support the new constitution. Apparently, national constitutions are like cars. After enough wear and tear, they can break down. But being in Iceland made me wonder how our own constitution is holding up. Did our founding fathers really imagine we'd abide by it for more than 225 years? Well, if anybody knows what the founders were really thinking, it's historian Rick Beeman.
How long of you did they take? I'm curious about this because you've talked about, as we think about the founders, what did the founders think about us? Did they look at this country? They wanted to build a country that would last 100 years, 1,000 years. Did they think about that?
If someone had, made a bet and said, this Constitution you're crafting will last 50 years, they'd say, not so sure about that. They would be astonished that it has lasted largely in the form in which they crafted it.
Really?
For 225 years.
But I guess what I'm saying is, wasn't that their intent? Didn't they want to craft a government that would last indefinitely? Or did they not know?
They had the humility to know that the union they were crafting was likely to be a fragile one, that it would almost certainly change as the country changed.
Right.
So they were creating a framework. But most important of all, they understood that this framework had to be a flexible framework.
The founders didn't all agree on how much flexibility there should be. Thomas Jefferson believed that each generation should give the Constitution a complete makeover, rewriting it to suit changing times. The earth belongs to the living, he said. James Madison disagreed. He thought the Constitution that he helped write had the best design anyone could come up with, and that frequent renovations would undermine the whole thing. In the end, the words written down in 1787 have never been thrown out. But built into the Constitution is a way to change it by adding amendments. Yale law professor Akhil Amar sees amendments as a kind of constitutional extended warranty.
One of the most amazing things about the Constitution is that vast creative white space after the last amendment. You know, it's like that billboard. Your message goes here. What are we going to put in that space? Is a deeply democratic idea that there remains work for our generation to do.
The process is spelled out in Article 5, and it's far from easy. It takes a 2/3 vote of both houses, or a national convention, to propose amendments, and then they have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. Over the past 2 centuries, thousands of amendments have been proposed, but only 27 of them have actually been ratified. Amendments have addressed small things like moving the date of presidential inaugurations and big things like ending slavery.
Here's the bottom line. We've had lots of good amendments and almost no bad ones. So amendments are basically on the side of history. They're sort of surfing with the current, with the arguable exception of prohibition, which didn't end so well. Okay, so every amendment has made amends, has made the system better.
In a way, each generation gets the chance to take part in revising the Constitution without having to start from scratch the way they did in Iceland. But amendments can take a long time to enact or even fail to pass. So there has to be another way to make changes without changing the Constitution. There is. It's by using the machinery the Constitution itself provides.
So you doing it?
No, I'm just hanging out here.
Okay,
I'm
good.
just trying to control my terror. You go on. Clarissa Shields is a pioneer in her sport. She won the gold medal in 2012, the first year that women's boxing was ever offered at the Olympics.
I remember when my boxing coach asked me, so why you want to box? And I said, because I'm tired of losing at basketball. And he said, okay. And I started boxing, and that was the first place I felt at home, man. I can't even explain it. You know how you go somewhere you just feel accepted?
Yeah.
Period?
Yeah.
That's how I felt.
Clarissa was born at the right time. With enough ability and dedication, there was no limit to how far she could go.
And I faced the body again.
But it wasn't that long ago that the idea of women in sports was considered, well, it wasn't really considered at all. When it came to sports, there were men who played sports, and that was pretty much it. In 1973, only 1 in every 27 women played a sport in high school. Now, it's 1 in 3. What caused such a dramatic change? We have to look back to the 1920s. Women had just won the right to vote, but they were still a long way from being treated as equals with men. It seemed like the best way to correct that was to change the Constitution to guarantee equal rights for women. So in 1923, the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, was introduced into Congress. But for 50 years, it went nowhere. In 1972, Congress responded to a groundswell of feminism by finally passing the ERA. Of course, the amendment wouldn't be law until the states ratified it.
This is the time that we will make women and men share equally in the greatness of America.
But that process soon stalled. For the ERA's supporters, it was a bitter disappointment. But there were other ways to bring about change without changing the Constitution. President Nixon had already taken one decisive step. He issued an executive order, and with the stroke of his pen, he created expanded opportunities for women in the federal workforce. Congress took further action. A provision was inserted into a funding bill, a section called Title IX, to ensure equal access and equal spending for women in federally funded education programs, including athletics. And the Supreme Court played its part too, by strengthening and broadening Title IX's protections. Over the past 40 years, Title IX has revolutionized women's sports. Christy Halbert was Clarissa's coach when she competed in the Olympics. She calls herself a Title IX baby. It's a different world for women in sports than when she was growing up.
How did you feel when Clarissa won gold at the Olympics? What was that moment like for you?
Well, I knew she was going to win.
Yes, having met her, I think I could have been equally confident.
Right. It was very exciting, and Clarissa was born at a time that she never knew that women couldn't participate in school sports and couldn't get scholarships, and she's never known a time in her life when women could not box in her country. All of those laws had to change, and policies had to be changed for her to have that opportunity. So that is success.
Even without ratifying a constitutional amendment, our government could bring about big changes for women. Title IX was not just about sports. It had a profound impact on our society as a whole.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Olympic medalists.
It's amazing to think how far we've come from those days to these days, and how we've done it using the same basic charter as our guide. But when the framers were writing the Constitution, they were worried less about its staying power and more about, well, power. After all, they had just fought a war against a British tyrant, and they weren't eager to see homegrown tyranny in their new government. So they separated power into 3 branches and built in ways for each branch to keep the others in check. 3 branches vying for dominance, but kept in balance. Sounds like your average day on YouTube. Well, it's also the big idea behind our government. Instead of having a king, one top dog, we have 3 hungry pooches, all out for the same chew toy called power. It's a high-stakes game, and it's another reason our Constitution has survived. Here's how it works. Congress can pass laws, but the president has an ace up his sleeve, the veto. The president can spend lots of money as head of the executive branch, but Congress has to approve his budget. As for the Supreme Court, it always has the final word on what the Constitution means. It can strike down a law passed by Congress or an act of the president by declaring it unconstitutional. When the Supreme Court says so, all bets are off.
So the Constitution sets up a divided government in which the 3 branches have to cooperate to get anything done. Great. But our Constitution also requires something else. It's not explicitly laid out in the text, but it was probably expected of us by our gentlemen founders. You can call it good manners, or maybe respect. The executive has to respect the Congress, it has to respect the judiciary, and on around again into a functioning government. It's sort of government by the consent of the guys who are governing to be governed by the other guys who are governing, right? But what happens if one branch, or one guy in one branch, just refuses and decides to do whatever the heck he wants?
It began during the presidential campaign of 1972. 5 burglars were caught planting listening devices at the offices of the Democratic National Committee in Washington's Watergate complex. The men were linked to the committee to re-elect the president in question, Richard Nixon. What followed was the 2-year-long Watergate scandal. Nixon had not actually ordered the break-in, but he orchestrated a cover-up, Hush money had been paid. The connections to the White House went deep. The FBI launched an investigation. So did the Washington Post and other newspapers. The Attorney General named a special prosecutor.
I welcome this kind of examination because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
When did you first begin planning the cover-up?
I don't think there was ever any discussion that there wouldn't be a cover-up.
The Senate convened a Watergate committee, and its televised hearings riveted the nation.
The misuse of power is the very essence of tyranny.
Mr. Nixon has acted more like an imperial ruler.
Lied repeatedly. Treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors.
Soon it was revealed that President Nixon had recorded everything that went on in the Oval Office. But when Congress and the special prosecutor demanded the tapes, the president defied them, citing executive privilege. Finally, Nixon provided transcripts, but they were edited with lots of holes and gaps and plenty of expletives deleted.
I have provided to the special prosecutor voluntarily all the material that he needs.
Congress, for the first time in more than 100 years, began to talk seriously about impeaching the President of the United States. Two branches of our government had reached an impasse. That's when the third branch, the Supreme Court, entered the fray, ruling that Nixon had to turn over the actual unedited tapes. This was the moment of crisis. Would the President of the United States obey the court's order even though he knew the tapes could cost him his presidency? In the end, the president did turn over the tapes. They revealed that he was deeply involved in the scandal and that he had lied to the American people. The House Judiciary Committee voted to recommend that the House impeach the president. Facing the certain prospect of removal from office, Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974, the first and so far only president to do so. So Watergate was a national trauma, but it was also a test. The executive branch defied Congress. Congress went to war with the president. The Supreme Court intervened, and Congress ended up removing a president from office, forcing him out. And all of this happened without troops in the streets. 187 years after it was written by men who never could have conceived of tape recorders or hidden microphones or televised hearings, the Constitution of the United States worked. One reason it worked is that in our country, everyone has to obey the rules, even the president. But the Constitution doesn't always provide a lot of guidance for figuring out those rules. It's a masterpiece of brevity, which may be one of its greatest strengths. In just 4 pages of parchment, the Constitution created our framework for government, but later generations have had to fill in a lot of the details. And whenever disagreements come up, the 9 justices on the Supreme Court are the referees. They make the final calls. But with so little to go on, how do they reach their monumental decisions? I thought I'd ask former Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. It's not really every day I get to talk to a Supreme Court justice, so before we get into it, I just had to ask her what really goes on behind closed doors when the Supreme Court is just, you know, hanging out in their robes, deciding cases.
Would I enjoy it if I could see it? Is it fun? When you guys sat around and argued stuff over?
Well, you may get kind of tired of it. They have a lot to say.
Really?
You might get bored.
Did you ever get bored?
Absolutely.
Really? Did you ever like take out your phone and started playing?
Never.
Never, no. Because I probably would, which is
no,
why I
well,
shouldn't
you can't. You have to pay attention.
So when you get to the toughest questions of the constitutionality of a federal law, say, in the Supreme Court, what were your guiding principles for making that decision?
To be fair, you have to read the law and try to fairly interpret the language and understand what was intended by the drafters of the language.
Right.
You have to follow precedent
Right.
and to become familiar with all of the cases in the past that are applicable.
Did you put a lot of weight into what's called original intent, what the founders or framers thought of as they wrote these particular?
Well, I think the first thing you look at is the language.
Right.
What did it say? And then you look at the precedents. What has the court said about that provision in the past?
Right.
And you try to follow those precedents if you possibly can.
Right. But It's sometimes difficult, especially when you get to larger constitutional issues, right? Because
sometimes the questions are very tough. Yes, indeed.
Right.
Very tough.
As the justices face their tough questions, they aren't all alone. Our Constitution may be only 4 pages long, but there must be millions of pages of Supreme Court decisions to draw from, representing the collective wisdom of all of their predecessors stretching back to 1790. Of course, today's justices are often sharply divided about how to make their decisions and how to interpret the Constitution, whether to stick to the presumed intent of 18th century Americans or interpret the document in the light of present-day experience. But even if the justices don't agree with each other, and even if we don't always agree with them, we abide by their decisions. They have the force of law. So our brief Constitution has lasted so long in part because we can make occasional repairs by adding amendments, then passing new laws. The 3 branches keep each other in check, and the system runs smoothly, just as designed. And if you believe that, I have a large obelisk in Washington I can sell you. Actually, the structure is a lot more fragile than you might think. It all depends on a precarious balance, and there are times when that balance just does not hold. Somebody once said that being shot at really focuses the mind. But during wartime, we are apt to lose our focus. And the Constitution can become a casualty. During the Civil War, for instance, Abraham Lincoln declared martial law, suspended habeas corpus, and tried Southern sympathizers in military courts. Actions some said were unconstitutional. He even ignored an order by the Chief Justice to reverse course. In 1942, soon after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt issued an executive order that led to the internment of more than 100,000 Japanese Americans, most of them American citizens. They were forced to abandon their homes and live in desolate camps until the end of the war, even though there was little evidence they posed a threat to national security. After 9/11, America mobilized to wage a new war against terrorism. Executive power kicked into high gear.
One of the first actions we took to protect America after our nation was attacked was to ask Congress to pass the Patriot Act.
The Patriot Act gave the administration broad authority to carry out wiretapping, surveillance, and the indefinite detentions of suspected terrorists. There was bipartisan support in Congress and the public for expanding government powers to fight terrorism. But many civil libertarians said the law ran afoul of the Constitution. Innocent people were caught up in the crackdown during the following years, including a young woman named Adama Ba.
So you were 16 years old, and it's 2005, and what happened?
I was sleeping in my bedroom, and federal agents came into the house. They walked me to the elevator, and my mom is like, "Where's she going? Where's she going?" And my brothers and sisters, because they didn't know, my mom didn't know I was going to get arrested.
Adama was picked up on immigration charges. She was surprised to learn that even though she had lived in the U.S. since she was a baby, her parents had brought her here illegally. But that's not the main reason the government was interested in her.
So your lawyer shows up.
And they start asking me all these weird questions. Have you ever took out a library book about bombs, about...
This is your lawyer's asking you?
Yeah, my lawyer's asking me, and I'm like, no. They start asking me, have you ever visited Osama bin Laden's website? I'm like, he has a website? And she goes, do you have any idea why you're here? I'm like, no, why? That was the first time she told me.
What did she tell you?
She was like, they suspect you of being a suicide bomber.
And do you know why they thought that you might have been a suicide bomber?
To this day, I don't know.
Really? You have no idea?
To this day, I don't know.
Adama was held in a Pennsylvania detention center and was subjected to frequent strip searches.
So they put me in this little cell, and I'm nervous, and I'm scared, and I'm like crying. I'm like, what's going on? I think at that moment, everything hit me, and I start washing my face and scrubbing my face. And I just keep scrubbing and scrubbing and scrubbing. And I just broke down. And I just sat on the floor and I just started crying more. Sorry.
After 6 weeks in detention, Adama was released, but the government has never revealed what evidence led them to believe that she was a suicide bomber. Adama Ba's story is unsettling, but there were hundreds of reports of abuses against people detained as possible terrorists. Complaints of human rights violations continued throughout the Bush years and beyond. President Obama faced controversy too for maintaining the indefinite detention of terrorism suspects and for drone attacks and targeted assassinations, including some aimed at American citizens. Article 2 of the Constitution puts the president in charge of the military, but many believe the executive branch in particular has gone too far in fighting the war on terror. Jack Goldsmith headed President Bush's Office of Legal Counsel.
Can you summarize what you think the constitutional obligation of the executive is in times of war?
Well, let's just say this is a perennial question.
Right.
Lincoln struggled with this in the Civil War. Roosevelt struggled with it in World War II. Article 2 of the Constitution is very short, and the powers it confers on the president are very general, and they're broadly worded. Forever, the country has been debating what those clauses mean, and it's still not settled. They're debated in every war.
Right.
And in every war, there are a lot of people who think the president acts too aggressively.
Right. Did we lose track of the Constitution in the panic after what happened there on 9/11?
There are many documented examples of the government going too far just after 9/11, rounding people up that they shouldn't have, and in some sense overreacting. And that always happens at the outset of war. I'm not making excuses, but it happens at the outset of the war. I don't think that those excesses taken alone, whatever they were, show that the Constitution wasn't working. The Constitution is not just about protecting rights, it's also about ensuring that we can have national security.
Right.
And the president at the outset of a war, especially a war in which he doesn't understand the enemy, we don't have intelligence, is going to do everything he can to keep the nation safe, and that means doing things that seem, from the perspective of hindsight, to be wrong.
In the aftermath of every war, there is plenty to regret. While we debate whether the government has gone too far, people suffer, and so do our institutions and our values. But war isn't the only time our system can break down. Sometimes the Constitution is threatened not by government action, but by government inaction.
Right now, for example, my home state of Illinois is having a huge fight in federal court with the other 5 states that border the Great Lakes. At issue is the Chicago River right here. It flows from Lake Michigan all the way downstream to the Mississippi River. The other states want Illinois to block this river, to cut it off. Why? To stop the progress of a vicious, dangerous alien invader.
These aliens may not be from outer space, but their impact on states' economies could be earth-shattering. They're called Asian carp.
These giant bottom feeders would destroy the region's $7.5 billion fishing industry, as well as the 800,000 jobs that are supported by it.
But this is not only an environmental and economic crisis, it's also a constitutional crisis. To learn why, I've come to a stretch of the Illinois River at the little town of Havana. It's a nice place, and the fish are jumping.
Holy moly. Well, now they're just showing off their numbers here.
So what are we doing out here? What's going on?
Well, we're out on the Illinois River, and we're running some electric current through these shockers. It makes the Asian carp jump out of the water so scientists can get a handle on how many fish are in the water here.
All right, I think I have the answer. There are a lot of fish in the... This is amazing.
The carp are spreading north and heading for the Great Lakes, and the Great Lakes states are up in arms about it. But it seems that the only way to stop the carp is to block the flow of the river, and that Illinois refuses to do. So how can these warring states solve their intractable problem?
Whenever anybody talks about these fish and the possibility of them getting to the Great Lakes, it's like the apocalypse. It's like War of the Worlds, except the aliens will win in the end. It sounds like this is turning into a failure of the federal system, that with these fish, the Constitution has met its match. It can't solve this problem.
Oh, the Constitution is absolutely up to the challenge. It's the current leadership in all 3 branches of government that's not taking their constitutional authority, their constitutional responsibility. The Supreme Court can resolve the disputes between the states. Congress can step up and create a policy or enact laws, allocate resources, And the president, as the head of the executive branch, can order his agencies to take more decisive action. So the federal government has the constitutional tools to solve this problem. It has the mandate, essentially, to solve this problem under the framework of our Constitution. They're just not stepping up and doing their job.
I know when the framers had a lot to deal with in Philadelphia, heat, bugs, they didn't have leaping fish attacking them.
I know I should love all animals. I'm an environmental lawyer, but I gotta say, these guys are pretty gross.
Oh! So that is the greatest threat to our nation since the Civil War right there.
Like, your constitutional provisions are no match for me.
This is the grossest thing I've ever held in my hands. And I have small children. There, I just made the problem slightly worse.
It sounds like the Constitution hasn't failed us as much as we've failed the Constitution. It needs us, citizens and politicians alike, to remain true to the document, or its words won't mean much. And that's true whether we're engaged in war, or battling over a bunch of slimy fish, or facing ordinary, everyday crises. Unfortunately, in Washington, dysfunction is now the status quo. Just turn on your TV.
Congress's approval rating is at an all-time low. Americans are growing less confident about the direction of the nation.
People don't like Congress.
Do nothing Congress.
This is gridlock of massive proportions.
We are on the brink of a partial government shutdown.
Shut it down!
What troubles me the most is I've never seen such polarization.
Washington is more polarized than ever.
When we look around the government today and we see it failing to function, we see laws can't get passed, we see the House can't agree with the Senate, and they both can't agree with the President. Was that built into the machinery, the possibility of that kind of disagreement?
The framers would have hoped that dysfunction would not have been built in to the structure of the government. But deliberation, absolutely.
It's not as if when they look into the future, they'll say, it'll be great. Congress will hate the President, the House will hate the Senate, therefore nothing bad will be done. Yeah. They assumed that with these limitations, people would act in good faith, agree, come to a consensus, act therefore with moderation.
That is exactly right. And again, a very important precondition of their thinking was that they did all think of themselves as civil, virtuous statesmen.
Right.
So partisanship and self-interest hopefully would always take a back seat to the public good.
But the framers failed to predict one important factor that's not mentioned in the Constitution, the rise of political parties. In fact, George Washington hated the idea of political parties. He was sure they would create too much friction and conflict. But by the time Washington left office in 1797, there they were, two parties taking opposing views on just about every issue. Sound familiar? Today, the two parties in Congress seem more polarized than ever. The aisle that traditionally separates them has become more like a no-man's land on a bloody battlefield. And with both sides locked in combat, well, not much gets done. Barney Frank spent 35 years in the trenches of the House of Representatives. Maybe he can explain what's going on. After all, he's well known for his mild manner and calm demeanor.
This is why your stupidity gets in the way of rational discussion.
And then
I'm not going to be bullied by your ranting. Blatant hypocrisy, a violation of the rules of the House.
Would the gentleman yield?
No, I said no.
Seriously, Congressman Frank is retiring, so I figured that on his way out the door, he could offer a parting glance and tell me why he thinks this place is such a mess.
Look, we are in a difficult situation now because of James Madison and the voters.
Wait, James Madison and the voters? We're in trouble because the father of the Constitution and these patriotic American voters are doing what exactly?
James Madison's role was to devise a unique system of government. So we have what's called the system of checks and balances. That can work much of the time except when the public gets into a mood. And the electorate as an entity sent two very different sets of people here in 2008 and 2010, and then said, okay, play nice. Well, there are some very fundamental differences here.
Is that a bug or a feature? I mean, is this like a flaw in the Constitution that it gave us this mess, or is it what it's supposed to do?
The basic structures work. That's, and they're not vague. But I think it is an imperfection. That is, I think we are excessively weighted in our constitutional system towards inaction. But it was not a serious one until it interacted with this very radical shift in the electorate.
Right.
So it becomes a flaw when you have the electorate sending people who are so different to two elections in a row.
The polarization in Congress is said to be just a reflection of the country as a whole, and it gets worse when we have the kind of seismic electoral mood swings that Barney Frank describes. But if our government is operating at less than maximum efficiency, well, some people think this isn't such a threat to our republic after all. In fact, my friend P.J. O'Rourke believes the framers would have preferred it that way.
What about this idea that people have created a recipe for stalemate, constant bickering, partisanship, and general misery? Or are you in favor of that?
I'm in favor of all those. Well, we have a three-way traffic jam here. And, you know, when you read the thing, it's clear that, that tyranny was more worrisome to the framers than legislative deadlock. They wanted it to be hard to look how hard it is to change the Constitution. You read the article about amending the Constitution. This is not something you can do like, you know, between breakfast, coffee, and, you know, and grabbing a sandwich at Subway. It's a big deal. And I don't think they wanted it to be easy to make laws. They were more worried by tyranny, by the kind of executive tyranny that was shown by the British government over the colonies, than they were worried about it being a little slow to get the Highway Appropriations Act through.
Right. So you think it's fine?
I think
it's working according to...
Anything really that slows, anything that slows the legislative process down so that people have to think twice before they act. Measure twice, cut once.
Well, what about the argument? What about the argument that, you know, all this stuff needs to be done, that we can't get it done?
Everything always needs to be done. You know, I mean, this is like the way we all feel when we wake up in the morning. Oh my God, there's so much that needs to be done. And then we go through the day, and we don't get any of it done.
That's true.
And the world doesn't end, you know. And then we realize at the end of the day, I should have had that Bloody Mary. You know?
Maybe PJ's right. Maybe the glacial pace of legislation isn't the worst thing in the world. But these days, partisan politics is doing more than just gumming up the works. Some say it's undermining the Constitution, threatening democracy itself. Imagine for a minute that, say, Ohio is a big, juicy apple pie. Ohio has 16 congressional districts, so, like a pie, Ohio has to be sliced up into 16 different pieces, and each piece gets to elect its own representative. Each district must have roughly the same number of people, and the district lines are supposed to be revised every 10 years, after each census. But the Constitution leaves the slicing and dicing up to the states. So the party in power can divide up the state however they want to make sure they stay in office. You can find a prime example of this in the city of Baltimore. That's where I'm meeting James Browning. He works for the group Common Cause, which advocates reforming the way congressional districts are drawn up.
Hello.
Hey, Peter, how are you?
I'm fine, James. How are you today?
Great.
So, this is the neighborhood you wanted to show me, right?
This is it, right along here. Sometimes with redistricting, it's not so much that there's a Democratic Party or a Republican Party, but there's an incumbent party, and they want to make sure that the incumbents are reelected. So they will pack lots of Republicans into a district to help a Republican win, pack lots of Democrats into a district, and what's lost are a lot of the voters in the middle.
Carving up districts for political gain is so common and so old a tradition it actually has its own name. Back in 1812, the governor of Massachusetts, Elbridge Gerry, created a district so ridiculously shaped that it resembled a demonic salamander. When you combine Gerry's name with salamander, you get a term as convoluted as the districts themselves. We call it gerrymandering. Nowadays, with advanced technologies and endless data, drawing these maps has become a partisan science down to the very street.
Oh, that's the congressional line, by the way. We said we just crossed from the 7th district into the 3rd district now, down the middle of this street.
It looks exactly the same. So how does this diminish, democracy? One person, one vote. We still get to vote, right?
Well, there should be the power, in a community to come together and elect someone who really connects with that district. But what happens with gerrymandering is it gets turned around, and you basically get communities moved around like pawns on a chessboard. This is another district line, by the way. So that's our 3rd district that we're in now, within about 2 blocks.
So we just walked through an entire congressional district in 1 block.
That's right. You could have a conversation standing here with someone standing 2 congressional districts away, just about.
So it's like Hello, I'm in another congressional district.
That's
Now
right.
I'm in yours. Now I'm in the other one. Well, that seems crazy. Why is there a congressional district 1 block long?
It's even crazier when you see the fractured, twisted shape of this district. But there's a method to the madness. It's designed to group together voters who usually vote the same way.
It's about what's best for the incumbent congressman, not what's best for the neighborhood.
Right. Basically, the better they are at drawing these funny-shaped districts, the worse off everybody else is.
Well, that's exactly right. And frankly, we're caught in a vicious cycle, too, where if the people in power are ever more partisan, they are more and more interested in making these partisan districts to support the extreme wings of their party.
Right. So it's just sort of the self-replicating cycle of misery.
Yes.
That's great.
Gerrymandering helps incumbents win. But the big losers are the voters. If representatives have safe seats, there's no reason to listen to any constituents who don't agree with them and didn't vote for them. The normal
I happen to carry a copy of the Constitution with me at all times.
Really? Why?
I do, because it's our most important document. It's where we all started our country, we the people of the United States. It governs how we operate in this country. It means everything. It says who passes the laws. It's vitally important to us. This little document, the Constitution, has enabled this country to live, to prosper, to develop, to be respected around the world. It's what governs our system. And I think it's done a remarkably good job through the years. We should be very proud of it. We should remember what it is and learn about it. We should teach successive generations about it and encourage young people to know and understand the Constitution.
Travel around America and you're bound to run into the Constitution. It seems to be everywhere.
The Constitution!
Our Constitution.
The Constitution?
You haven't read the Constitution.
This little document, it means everything to us.
It's like the Big Bang. It's the most momentous thing to happen in the modern world.
The Constitution has been around for more than 225 years, but many of us don't have any idea what it says. Of course, that's never stopped us from arguing about what it means. I'm Peter Sagal, and I'm taking a journey across the country to find out how the Constitution works in the 21st century. In this episode, the framers thought they'd come up with a pretty good system, but even they didn't really think the Constitution would be around forever.
They would be astonished that it has lasted in the form in which they crafted it.
In fact, it's lasted longer than any other written constitution still in use today.
This is a brilliant thing that we did.
Along the way, it's been pushed to the brink.
I'm not a crook.
And stretched to the breaking point.
In every war, there are a lot of people who think the president acts too aggressively.
So there are like federal agents in your bedroom. You're a 16-year-old girl.
Police officers, everything.
Over the years, we've given that document a real workout. And these days, it seems like it's taking a lot of hits.
We are on the brink of a partial government shutdown.
This dysfunction is brought about by the election of crazy people.
And what's lost are a lot of the voters in the middle.
We the people have to have an intervention. Uncle Sam is a drunk.
Your constitutional provisions are no match for me.
Is our Constitution up to the challenges of the 21st century?
Civics is a dirty business, ladies and gentlemen. Sometimes the search for the American Constitution takes you places even a Harley can't go. Welcome to Reykjavik, Iceland. This country of about 300,000 people became an international financial capital during the boom years. Then in the crisis of 2008,
everything fell apart. The three largest banks collapsed. Parliament, which meets in that building over there, fell. The prime minister resigned. Now, to keep anything like this from ever happening again, the people of Iceland right now are engaged in creating and then approving a brand new national constitution. They're throwing the old one out and starting again. The Icelanders took a real 21st century approach, inviting ordinary citizens to submit ideas via Facebook and Twitter. That's why Article 6 is nothing but cat videos. All right, I'm kidding. Maybe they're on to something, creating a new constitution, one that's custom-built for modern times. Some of the members of the Constitutional Council are traveling the country to promote their new crowd-sourced. Stops is a remote fishing village where they will try to get the locals to support the new constitution. Apparently, national constitutions are like cars. After enough wear and tear, they can break down. But being in Iceland made me wonder how our own constitution is holding up. Did our founding fathers really imagine we'd abide by it for more than 225 years? Well, if anybody knows what the founders were really thinking, it's historian Rick Beeman.
How long a view did they take? I'm curious about this because you've talked about, as we think about the founders, what did the founders think about us? Did they look at this country, they wanted to build a country that would last 100 years, 1,000 years? Did they think about that?
If someone had, made a bet and said, this Constitution you're crafting will last 50 years.
Yeah.
They'd say, not so sure about that. They would be astonished that it has lasted largely in the form in which they crafted it.
Really?
For 225 years.
But I guess what I'm saying is, wasn't that their intent? Didn't they want to craft a government that would last indefinitely? Or did they not know?
They had the humility to know that the union they were crafting was likely to be a fragile one, that it would almost certainly change as the country changed.
Right.
So they were creating a framework. But most important of all, they understood that this framework had to be a flexible framework.
The founders didn't all agree on how much flexibility there should be. Thomas Jefferson believed that each generation should give the Constitution a complete makeover, rewriting it to suit changing times. The earth belongs to the living, he said. James Madison disagreed. He thought the Constitution that he helped write had the best design anyone could come up with, and that frequent renovations would undermine the whole thing. In the end, the words written down in 1787 have never been thrown out. But built into the Constitution is a way to change it by adding amendments. Yale law professor Akil Amar sees amendments as a kind of constitutional extended warranty.
One of the most amazing things about the Constitution is that
if you compare the Kurdish regions in Iraq with the rest of Iraq right now, I would say that overall, well, it's quite ambiguous. On one level, women are doing much better because the overall security situation is much better. I mean, I was able to walk around freely in Abid and Suleimania, which I wouldn't dare to do in Baghdad these days. So on this level, it is much better. But you have a big difference in Iraqi Kurdistan between women who are urban middle-class women and women who live in the countryside. And one of the big paradoxes, and many of us are trying to understand this phenomenon, is that while overall you have a kind of opening up, you have it's being sold as the success story. I mean, people are investing in it, education is flourishing. But actually, honor killings and female suicides right now have taken on epidemic proportions. Right? So when I went to Iraqi Kurdistan, I was really quite struck by this contradiction. On the one level, yes, I saw that it was quite okay for women to be out there in the public sphere. They didn't have to be worried to be kidnapped or to be shot at. I know that in terms of women who go to university, numbers are increasing in terms of girls getting school education. But when it comes to violence against women on a sort of more domestic scale, it's actually worse than it was a couple of decades ago. Sometimes what looks like a suicide, which is, you know, I said the sort of traditional way of people killing themselves in Kurdish areas is through burning. So actually we sometimes don't know whether it was actually honor killing covered up as a suicide, because, you know, then you have a burned body and you cannot really tell. But they do think that there is an increase, and well, you know, it has something to do with depression, with the lack of ability to express themselves in other ways. Sometimes it's a cry for help. I mean, as you find in the West as well, you know, often people don't really mean to kill themselves, but they find that no one is paying attention to their needs, and so it's a kind of cry for help. Unfortunately, if you actually put benzene over your body or petrol and you burn yourself, then there's a good chance that you won't survive it.
We have done a research on the issue, the female suicide problem in Turkey plus in Kurdistan, Iraq, in Kurdish region, because this has been like widely. It's happened mostly among the Kurdish women and in Kurdish region. Of course, there are a lot of reasons. You can put a lot of social, economical, and political conditions and questions behind why is happening and why is happening in that particular region, and what might be the reason behind it. We have published a report. Of course, you cannot put any single condition behind it, but one of the main reasons behind that one is that the conditions that Kurds live, the issue hasn't been addressed. The Kurds left in a position that their problem hasn't been addressed, and it's not going to be addressed in the near future. That creates a certain amount of tendency in the region and differences, basically.
بێگومان ڕەنگە ئێمە هەنە زانیاری بەم باو ڕەنگە پێسەیر بێ کە ئێمە حیزبێکی لە 148 ئەندامەکانمان ئافرەتە. ئێستا ئێمە لە 148 ئەندامەکانمان ئافرەتە و ئێمە 3 ئەنداممان لە سەرکردایەتی یەکگرتووە ئافرەتەیە و لە مەکتەبی سیاسی ئەندامی ئافرەتمان هەیە، جگە لە هەموو دام و دەستگاکانی ئێمە کە ئافرەتمان هەیە. بەڵێ لە ڕیزی پەرلەمانتارەکانە لە هەرێمی کوردستان سیتاری ئافرەتمان هەیە، لە بەغاش پەرلەمانتارێکی ئافرەتمان هەیە. بە کورتی ئێمە لە ڕوانگەی ئێمەوە هەموو تنوتیژیەک دەرحەق بە ئافرەت قەدەغەیە و هەموو ئەو تاوانانەی کوشتن لە کوردستانە کراون ئیداناکەین و بە تاوانێکی دژی ئیسلامی دانین، چکم هەتا نە بە گوێرەی قانون کە هەنێ قانونێکەیە لێرە، قانونی عقوباتی عێراقی تا ڕادەیە لایەنگری پیاوە، بەڵام ئەگەر بە پێی سەرەتاکانی هەتا شەریعەتی ئیسلامی بێ هەموو ئەو ئافرەتانەی لە کوردستان کوژراون نەئەبووە یەکێکیان کوژدێ، چکم لە شەریعەتی ئیسلامی بۆی ئافرەتێ تەنانەت ئەگەر ئەوانەی بڕواشیان بۆ هەیە لەسەر خیانەتی زەوجی یا زیناکردن بکوژدێ ئەبێت 4 شایەت پرۆسەی سێکس و جنسەکان بینی بێ ئەنجام کوژدێ. بۆیە ئەمە بە بەشێک لە ئەو دواکەوتوویە کۆمەڵایەتیە و ئەو قۆناغی ئینتیقالی هەرێمی کوردستانە پێیتێ پڕەوە ئەو ناگیرگیری و نائارامیەی کە لە وڵاتەیە هەیە و خۆشبەختانە لە 10,000 ئەندامی یەکگرتووی ئیسلامی کوردستانە تاکو ئێستا یەک ئەندامی ئێمە لە دوور و نزیکۆ تۆمەتبار نییە بە کوشتنی یەک ئافرەت لە هەموو کوردستان.
You know, in Iraqi Kurdistan, as many other contexts where there are liberation struggles, you find that Kurdish women were involved in the Peshmerga. I mean, they were actually fighting, women, you know, fighting, carrying arms, but also very much supporting the male fighters. And so in that context of a people fighting a liberation struggle, women have played an active role. And you find that some of the women who were Peshmerga now have prominent political positions linked to one of the 2 political parties. And then since 1991, really, you know, since the de facto semi-autonomous region, you know, after the Gulf War and the establishment of the safe haven. In Iraqi Kurdistan, in contrast to the rest of Iraq, there was actually a flourishing of a civil society, and at the forefront you had women's rights activists, women's organizations, civil society. So on that level, yes, women actually have historically played a role, but again, you know, when we speak in terms of numbers, you know, that women always presented a minority, but they were part of it. But when you really look deeply, you find that women and women's issues are marginalized within the Kurdish political struggle. When the issue was getting rid of Saddam, you know, women's rights would come second to the wider issue of fighting the Ba'ath regime. Or women's issues come second to the fight for the Greater Kurdistan. And I think now I spoke to many women's rights activists who expressed their disappointment and disillusionment. You know, they thought, well, now that we are in a position where we have our own government, we have parliament, still our politicians do not really consider women's rights a priority. Yes, lots of lip service is being paid to it, but obviously in a situation where people are struggling over issues, big issues such as federalism, the status of Kirkuk, the first issue that is being negotiated away are women's rights. And that is cause of much frustration for many Kurdish women's rights activists.
I think there's certainly been a clear and noticeable attempt to bring more women into positions of authority within the KRG and into the Kurdistan National Assembly. And traditionally, women in Kurdistan have always held positions of prominence within political parties, within the government structures as well. There is a little bit of schizophrenia, though, within Kurdistan. On the one hand, in I suppose the public sector and in the political parties, you do often find women in positions of prominence, whereas in home and in private life, there is something of a problem with the role of women in society. That's very clear. Kurdistan has pretty horrific examples of honour killings and conservative views of the role of women in society. But I think if we look at what's happening within the governmental structures themselves, there is an interesting and noticeable move towards empowering women to a greater effect. Whether this is window dressing or not is another question, but if you meet some of the women who have these positions, you wouldn't accuse them simply of being window dressing of a scheme that's just hiding a wider patriarchal system. They would probably bite your head off if you said that, and these can be tough people. So I think perhaps the way the KRG has empowered women is something they should be applauded for. It needs to filter down into wider Kurdish society, which is still very, very traditional and conservative at its core. But it's an interesting picture.
للرانجي إما أفرد بوي هي بدأ بأمينداري جشتي حزب كمان بدأ بسروكي هرمي كردستان بدأ بوزير بدأ ببرلمانتار وبيستا ما في آزادي هالبجاردني هاوسري خويه بدور بينها متنو تيجيكوا ما فا آزادي مدني وسياسي وكمالاتي كاني بطاوتي بردستبه بوي إما خومن ببشه لبري إصلاح زانين بو باشكرتني جاني أفرتان لولاتي إما.
I personally think it's a good thing. It's a first good step if any party, whether it is the Communist Party or the a liberal party or an Islamic party, has women. I mean, personally, if I have a choice between 10 Islamist men and 10 Islamist women, I'd like the women to be there as well, which doesn't mean, of course, that they represent women's rights issues. I mean, which is one of the things that we see in the Iraqi parliament, where there is the quota of 25%, and we see that most of the women in the Iraqi parliament are either the wives or the sisters or the daughters of male conservative politicians, and I suspect it's very similar in the Islamic party. Okay. However, having said that, I think we need to give it some time. I think that as time goes by and when women are exposed to this political experience, they will stop just looking around before a vote to see what their male relatives are voting and start to establish their own political voice. But certainly numbers alone are not enough. I think it's a very first step, but we know there's a big difference. I mean, you know, women could be their own worst enemies, you know, in terms of actually not promoting, but, you know, even hindering women's rights struggle. I know that even the other parties, there are some women there who are actually making a case for women's rights, but many of the Kurdish women in parliament are first and foremost members of the specific political party with specific orientation and also nationalists. I mean, I think that's a big tension in the Kurdish political arena, that there is a kind of tension, contradiction between a kind of women's rights agenda and a nationalist agenda. There were sort of some historical points when they came together, but I think we now have come to a point where there's sort of a tension where all, you know, whatever political party women feel that they have to sort of take a step back to actually, because now the big issues are being discussed again.
These are the most vulnerable part of the society, women and children. And the traditional structure of the Kurdish society doesn't help these people to get enough support and advice or encourage from a male-dominated society to integrate into conditions that they didn't want to be living in. For example, most of the women committing suicide in Turkey, in Kurdish women, have IDP background. These people were living in a village in a peaceful conditions, probably in a conditions that is enough for them to live and survive, and then they were forced to the cities and big cities to live another life. There are a lot of, and there's stricter control by the male in the cities over the women in order to prevent anything in their understanding mistaken to happen, or she goes and do something that they don't want to appreciate or they don't want to accept it. So that creates a lot of other pressure among the families on the women, and that there's some sort of impact on these suicides. There's some sort of reason for this one, but there are a lot of other reasons behind this one. We have done a big report for the European Parliament, commissioned by the European Parliament, and we will continue to do that one. I mean, in Kurdish region as well, I mean, they have ministries.
History